Hello and welcome to Nigerian Rule. I've got a special guest today. He's a pastor, he's a Keep Fit instructor, he's a speaker, and he is one heaven of a prolific writer. People say one hell, but I'm saying he's one heaven of a prolific writer. Pastor Joseph, welcome to Nigerian Rule.
Thank you, Jude. It's great to be with you.
Fantastic having you on. I've tried to have you on. I was telling a friend of mine that whenever I decide to do one of my Skype recordings, you will be the first. And I couldn't get you a few days ago, so I had another pastor, Pastor Charles. But I'm glad you're on today. I'm glad you're on.
Well, I'm honored to be here. Honored to be on.
Um, you're based in America. I'm currently in the UK. But how would you describe yourself, Pastor Joseph? I mean, if you were to stand up in front of an audience, how would you describe yourself?
That's an interesting question because depending on the audience, I think the thing that I'd like people to know most about me is that I call myself a traveler, which is why my blog is called The Journeyman. In other words, I consider life a journey, and I consider the notion that we're all on this journey traveling through life, trying to ensure that we make the best of the journey. Now, as a Christ follower, I have some very specific guidelines. One of those is that the love of God must be reflected through me in all that I do every single day. That I must understand that because I'm a traveler, I'm a guest at certain times in certain environments. And so grace is important. It's important for me to not think that I have all the answers, that I know it all, but that I'm learning as I go along the way. And so what I'd want people to know about me is that I'm a traveler who loves Jesus Christ very much, and I'm on this journey hoping to travel alongside people of like mind. I'm discovering every day what it means to be human.
Wow. Okay, a traveler based in America. Well, first and foremost, you're a Nigerian, but you're in America. Would you regard yourself as a Nigerian in diaspora?
That's a very interesting question, and I say it's an interesting question because I live in America by choice. I have dual nationality in legal terms. In other words, I have both an American passport and a Nigerian passport. So in some regard, am I a Nigerian in diaspora? I'd consider myself an ambassador from Nigeria to the rest of the world because I'm living outside of Nigeria. So my goal is to represent Nigeria as well as I can, all the good things about Nigeria to the best of my ability. So in that sense, yes, I'm a Nigerian. I'm living in diaspora, and I'm, if some might say, a self-appointed ambassador, but I don't know that I'm self-appointed because every single Nigerian who lives outside of Nigeria is automatically an ambassador to the country because whatever you do as a Nigerian, people are observing, and they're going to reflect and understand Nigeria based on what they see from you. So in that sense, you're an ambassador, a representative. So that's the long answer to that question.
It's actually very interesting because it's actually that answer is leading me on to my next to the next question. If you receive an email today from, let's say, the president of Nigeria to come and serve in Nigeria, what would your response be?
I'm so glad that you told me up front that you were not going to you were not going to prep me for these questions. You were just going to throw them at me so I could give natural answers, because some of these questions are a lot harder than I would imagine, because maybe I'm not really willing to give answers to these questions. So let me put it this way, Judy, sort of as a backdrop, you know that a few years ago, I lost a sister, 2012 to be precise, on Dana Air, the flight that crashed in Nigeria. And as we all know, that was a flight, an ill-fated flight that didn't have to happen. It was just corruption in a system. And so since then, as I've navigated this journey, I first wrote a book. The book, while it's out there available for the public, it's an ebook. It was really written for me, because it was a catharsis. It was my process of healing. So I was very stark in the book. It was obvious that I was hurt and angry and bitter, but I didn't care about that. I wasn't trying to pretend. I wanted that book to be an honest reflection of my journey and how I felt about Nigeria. And so it's taken me many years. And my first trip back to Nigeria since then was actually this past year, when a good friend of mine who was hosting a conference felt like the Lord had really told him that he wanted me to come and speak at that conference. Now, I accepted that invitation for two reasons. One was because I have a lot of regard for this man who invited me. And his timing couldn't have been more impeccable, because my father-in-law was celebrating his 85th birthday. And my wife and I had determined that we wanted to go. And so they were going to pay for my ticket to come speak at the conference. And the conference, as it turned out, was beginning the week after the weekend of my father-in-law's 85th birthday. So it all seemed perfectly in line. So it was my first trip back to Nigeria. And it began a process of what I might call healing from all of that. So if the president were to call me today to come serve, I'm not pretentious about saying that in the past I've called Nigeria a failed state. I still in many ways believe that. But what does that say about the 180 odd million Nigerians that live in the country? I'm certainly not disparaging them. I'm not suggesting that they are not making efforts to make things better, at least many of them. But my idea of service is being able to, I have to believe that if I serve in a place, I will leave an imprint or a footprint large enough to make a difference in people's lives. Do I think that about Nigeria today? The honest answer is no. So if the president were to call me and say, hey, I need you to come serve in my cabinet or do whatever, my answer would be, thank you so much for the honor, but no. And the reason for that is because I don't believe that I have enough of a free hand to make a difference. There are systems that are so deeply entrenched in the Nigerian culture and attitude that I think it would be impossible for just one man to make that much of a difference. Because at every point in the road, you'll face roadblocks, especially a man like me who's lived abroad for so long, because the natural response of the Nigerian to people like me is, you don't know what we're doing. You don't know what life is like here. You don't know what we're talking about. You've lived abroad. You think this is like America. It is not. And we use those kind of statements to justify bad behavior and corruption. So, for instance, I'll give you a basic example. You're given a contract, and you're told, okay, the contract will actually cost 20 million, but I want you to write it for 50 million so that you can give me a kickback of 20 million, and you can keep 10 million profit for yourself and then use the 20 million to actually do the contract. And people say that's the cost of doing business in Nigeria. I don't want to pay that kind of cost. That kind of cost impinges on my conscience and my values. But if you stand in the way of that, if you say, I'm not doing it, they'll find someone else to step in and do it anyway. And those people who will do it poorly so that they can make more profit for themselves, because it's all about greed. So I don't believe that I'm able to make enough of a difference for Nigeria, in Nigeria. Now, if I was asked, would I be willing to represent Nigeria as an ambassador to the United Nations, to one of the more powerful countries in the world, that's a consideration I'd be willing to make, because I recognize that I understand what it's like to live in a foreign culture. I understand how to communicate with people and communicate a message that is palatable and well accepted. Now, I also understand that I'd be representing Nigeria, but at least I'd be able to use a language that would represent Nigeria well to the people that I was speaking to. So that would be something I would consider. But to go back there and work, no.
Wow.
Yeah.
That was very interesting, because incidentally, I was to ask you a question about, the untimely loss of your sister, Hadiza. And my question was, 153 passengers were killed in that unfortunate crash. When you got the news, forgive me if you don't want to go into it, I would perfectly understand. I would understand. But my question is, it was a needless death, and have you been able to forgive Nigeria for that needless death?
I've also learned about my faith journey that it's very important for me to be authentic and real, not to give the pat religious answers that everybody expects. The typical Nigerian, it is well answer, when it is actually not well, and there's all kinds of turmoil going on inside of you. So, if you asked me this question, so this was 2012, so we're talking 4 years removed. Mm-hmm. If you'd asked me this question 3 years ago, I would have told you categorically, absolutely not. But as a result of my encounter in Nigeria last year when I went for this conference, I realized certain things. I realized, for one, that the bitterness traps only me, nobody else. Because people continue to live the way they're living. Other tragedies have since happened, and life just goes on. And I realized that God doesn't make mistakes. So God didn't birth me in Nigeria by accident. There is a reason I'm a Nigerian. I don't fully understand all of it yet, and I'm in my 50s. But I still don't fully grasp what the whole reason is. But here's what I do know. That to the extent that I want God to be able to use me to make that country better, I must be willing to embrace that country with all that she is. So have I forgiven Nigeria? I would say to you categorically, yes. Do I fully trust that Nigeria has learned from all of this stuff that continues to go wrong? No, I don't think so, which is why I gave the answer I gave about your previous question about would I be willing to go and serve. Obviously, if I was still bitter, I would have said, no, I will serve in no capacity whatsoever. But I am willing to serve in a certain capacity, just not there, in the context of being in country. I call it the boiling frog syndrome. You've probably heard that phrase before. If you take, this is scientifically proven, if you take a frog and you put it in because frogs are cold-blooded creatures, if you put it in a pot of cold water and you gently bring that water to the boil, it'll cook the frog to death because it's not able to regulate or measure its body temperature. But if you actually drop a frog in a boiling pot of water, it will instantly leap out because it instantly feels the heat of the boil. So I call that the boiling frog syndrome, in that when you live in Nigeria in the midst of the melee of all that's going on every day, it's kind of bringing you to a slow boil and you cook to death in that pot.
Wow.
So it's easier for me to be of value to Nigeria outside of the context of being in Nigeria, because I can see objectively and I have a basis for comparison because I live in a different culture.
Understood. Wow. That's interesting. I follow you on Facebook, and your commentaries and thoughts are so profound, if I may say. This was why I was very, very keen to have you on Nigerian Real. You are real. Anybody that watches this program will know that you are real. You say it as it is. You're a pastor. You pastor a church, I believe. You live your life with a view to embedding the message of the gospel in a good story, while seeking to travel with others of like mind, as you've mentioned. What, in your opinion, is the role of a pastor? Are you a preacher, the actor on stage?
It's a fantastic question. I would say that the role of a pastor, in fact, I wrote something down, so I'll read it to you. It's very interesting that I had no idea you were going to ask this question, but here's something I've said to the people that I pastor on a regular basis. My role in your life is not to tell you how to live, but to give you a roadmap and permission to travel. Remember, I said I'm a traveler. So here's what I mean by that, essentially. Because many pastors, or too many pastors, think that their job and role in people's lives is to tell them, this is how you must live, this is what you must do, this is what you must do. But I actually don't believe that, and I don't see that in the scriptures. In fact, all I see is in the scriptures is Jesus giving people a roadmap. So notice that he never said to his disciples, you must learn how to pray, and you have to pray this way, and you have to pray this many hours a day, and you have to do this, otherwise you lack spiritual power.
Wow.
Here's what he did. He created a hunger in his disciples. Do you know, Jide, that he first sent them out to preach before they even knew how to pray? Because it was when they returned from him sending them out that they began to say to him, you know what, the demons flee in our name. All of this stuff is happening and going on. And then they said to him, Lord, teach us to pray. So what he did was he created a hunger in them. That hunger is the roadmap. Because what we want to do is we want to create in people a hunger for the things of God, to be aware that there is no better, truer life without Jesus than the one that we live. And when you create that hunger in people, they ask you questions, and then you say, here's how the scriptures teach that we should live our lives. For instance, I tell people all the time, you'll almost never hear me use the phrase Christian. I use the phrase disciple, because Jesus never called us Christians. And if I were to ask you today, define Christian for me, how would you define it? Because in actual fact, in the scriptures, the first time the word was used, it was used in a derogatory context. It wasn't used in a complimentary context. It was used by the Romans to describe those followers of Christ. Remember, they were persecuting them, feeding them to lions. They weren't applauding them. It was not a complimentary term. But Jesus never called his disciples Christians. He called them disciples. And I tell people that is a fearsome term when you think about it. It elicits in you a great deal of terror. You know why? Because a disciple does the bidding of his master, not his own. He has no will of his own. When you're a disciple, you do whatever your master says. And so when we are called to be disciples, we're called to live the way Jesus calls us to live, not the way I think we should live, not the way I tell you should live. So my role is not to tell you how to live. My role is to create a hunger in your life by living a life in front of you, by teaching you what the scripture says, providing a roadmap, and then giving you permission to travel. In other words, as I talk to you, as I live my life in front of you, I create in you this passion to want to do more, just like Jesus did in his disciples. That is permission to do more. So that's what I believe my role is as a pastor.
Well, do you think there's...
So it's not just about... Go ahead.
Do you think there's a lot of burden placed on pastors nowadays?
Maybe some of it is self-imposed, no doubt, because I think we've created for ourselves this notion that we must have all the answers because we're spiritual men, we're praying men, so we hear from God directly. So any question that you ask me, I must have an answer from God for. So and if I don't, I have to spiritualize my answer, so it seems it's from God. That's a burden, but it's a burden that's self-imposed, really, because as you said, I like to live authentic in front of people. Here's what I realize. There's only one that's perfect, and that's Jesus. Not you, not me. And that means if I'm not perfect, I'm going to make some mistakes.
Wow.
No matter how much I pray, no matter how much I seek God, no matter how much I read the scriptures. Have you never seen people read the scripture? You can put 10 people in a room, have them read the same verse, and you'll have 11 different interpretations of the same verse. But we've all prayed, we've all sought God. So who's right and who's wrong? Ultimately, we're human, and we filter everything through the context of our culture, our education, all of those shape us. Look at a guy in the village in Nigeria, one of the villages who has no education, but he loves God, and he's learned faith from whoever's taught him Christianity. He can barely read because he's not educated, so he interprets the Bible in the context of his own culture. I read one of those funny things that they post out there. It was a sign in front of a church in Nigeria. The photograph said, do not wear makeup, or if you wear a dress or a skirt that is not below your knees, you will be kicked out of church and disgraced. Now, you know what? When I read that, I shuddered, but I realized exactly what they're trying to do. That is their interpretation of holiness. This church in the village considers holiness for women wearing dresses that cover their knees, not wearing makeup. To them, that's the interpretation of holiness. They don't understand that it has a lot more to do with the heart condition than the external. But even if they do, maybe they think that what you wear is interpreting what's going on inside your heart. So they interpret makeup as being, oh, you are more interested in worldly things. So that's their interpretation of holiness. And they put up a sign that actually pushes people away rather than draws people into Christ. So are they right or wrong? I leave you to be the deciding factor. But you find that in every culture. Every culture, you interpret the gospel. I say this to you, Julie. A guy who's born in Pakistan or Afghanistan or Syria or Iran today, to a radical Islamic parent who believes in jihad, strapping on bombs and blowing up innocent non-believers. Do you blame that kid for becoming like his father? Don't we all aspire to be like our fathers? Don't we all want to grow up to be what we're taught? His chances of becoming a believer in the scriptures are much slimmer than my son or my daughter's chances. because I was raised in a faith and I impart that same faith to my kids. I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying his chances are more difficult because of the context of the culture in which he's raised. So one can only hope and pray that he finds exposure to the gospel in one way or another, so that he sees truth before he himself becomes a radical Islamic terrorist, killing innocent people. That's all we can do, is hope and pray. If we ourselves are not the channel by which God brings us into contact with such a person. So all of us, no matter what you believe, our worldview, our faith is shaped by our culture, our education, the context in which we live, all of those things. And so because of all of that, when I think about a pastor who is under a lot of pressure, I think it has a lot to do with all of those things. Because if you grow up and live and pastor in the Nigerian context, maybe there's more pressure on you because you feel you have to perform. I don't. Like you said, on my Facebook, when I write authentically. I tell you about the things I struggle with, about my life and all that. And people are drawn to it. Maybe because in this culture, people think that is more real. That is more honest. There is more integrity in that, because if a guy stands up in front of me and tells me he never messes up, he never sins, I can't live up to that. So I can't relate to that guy. That's what I'm discovering in my journey.
Wow.
And so, yeah.
What is, Pastor Joseph, what's the role of a church in a society? And let's be specific to Africa, for instance. What is the role of a church?
Okay. That's okay. So if we're being specific to Africa, and let me be more specific to Nigeria, because Nigeria, I know. I grew up there. I've experienced it. I've been in ministry in Nigeria. I can't speak for every country. So I would say that the role of the church in Nigeria would be to lead in the forefront of living with character and integrity. That means we need to be the ones creating the context in which people understand the difference between black and white. Understand that certain things that we call the cost of doing business are not the cost of doing business, they are sin. And we must be willing to stand up and say that, and to ourselves turn away from that, even at the cost of not making millions. The role of the church in the culture is to reflect Jesus so powerfully that when people see the church, they are convicted to do right. When they see a Christ follower come in, they don't think he has a price and I will find his price. They think character integrity has come in. We've got to shape up. We've got to live. And not because of judgment or condemnation, but simply because of the way you choose to live. Wow. That's what Jesus did. I mean, think about it. I mean, think about the woman at the well. No, let's forget about her for a minute. Let's even think about the woman caught in adultery. Was adultery wrong? Yes, there was no dispute about that. Jesus didn't dispute that. He knew it was wrong. Did he not know what the law of Moses said concerning stoning the adulterer? Yes, he did. But here's what he did. He went to her with compassion, knowing she was a sinner, knowing she had committed adultery. Let's not talk about the guy who had committed adultery with her, who probably was one of the guys holding the stones too. Jesus simply said, if you have no sin, cast the first stone. One by one, they walk away. And then he turns to her and says, where are your accusers? None? Then I'm not accusing you. I'm not judging you either. Here's all I'm saying to you. Go and sin no more. But he knew adultery was wrong. But he wasn't beating her over the head with it. You are an adulteress. You did wrong. You did. Even the woman at the well, same thing. Go call your husband. He knew she had no husband. What was he doing? He was setting her up to open her heart and be honest. I have no husband. You're right. You haven't. You've had 5. And the one you're living with now is not even your husband. And then he began to speak to her. So how do you speak to a woman so clearly, so powerfully, exposing her deepest, darkest secrets and pain? And yet, when you're done talking to her, she gets up, goes back to the town and says to the people, come and meet a man who told me all that I ever did. Could this be the Messiah? In other words, she was not condemned. She was convicted by his love. That's what we lack. We lack the ability to love people in their brokenness, understanding that we are also broken and we have been loved by Jesus. And we want others to love us and accept us with all of our brokenness, but we're unwilling to do so to others. And I think if the church in Nigeria would lead that charge, people would be less likely to call us hypocrites. But the church in Nigeria seems to lead the charge in so many things that are wrong. We talk about wealth as if wealth is only about money, and as if that is the God-given birthright of the believer. But when I look through scriptures, I see Jesus himself saying, in this world, you will have trouble. I see Paul, who wrote 3/4 of the New Testament, telling us of all of the stripes and suffering and pain he's received. And yet, he's still living for the gospel. I look at Hebrews chapter 11. I look at all the men and women of faith who were scourged, sawn in half. Are you kidding me?
Wow.
These were praying people. These were godly people. And yet, they never gave up faith. They never testified that this life we're living is not the one God called us to live. We need to be praying more for more money, more success, more wealth. I mean, that's absurd. We have interpreted or misinterpreted the gospel to be about money. And that's how we measure success. Well, if that's true, then I've always said we should all become Mormons, because the Mormon church is the wealthiest church in the world. They own Pepsi. They own the Marriott chain of hotels. I mean, they own so much around the globe. So if wealth is the single measure of God's blessing, then clearly God is blessing the Mormon church, and we have all missed it. We should all become Mormons.
Wow. 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 You're such a passionate believer in God. If you happen to come across someone who says there's no God, how would you define God? What's the definition of God?
I love that question, because that question is very easy and simple to answer. Because Jesus said, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. So Jesus was saying, in the way that I live, you can see God, because you've never physically seen him. And then he says to us, go and be like me. So what do I say to the person? I don't say anything. I just live a life in front of them. I just love them and live in front of them. We have people at our gym like that. I have a guy who came to me one time at our gym, struggling, had some issues. And as he walked in, he said, hey, coach, can I talk to you? I said, yeah, let's sit down and chat. And he said, I've noticed every time I'm around you, I feel a lot better, a lot happier. I've been struggling. I've got some stuff going on. So I said, I'd noticed that, but I didn't want to press. I wanted to give you an opportunity to talk about it when you felt like. He said, I'm an agnostic, but my grandfather was like you. He was a Baptist preacher, and so I got on really well with him. But over the years, with my relationship with my parents, I became an agnostic. But when I'm around you, I feel like I did with my grandfather. I feel something different. And so I just wanted to open up. So he talked to me about some issues that he was going through, which are personal, so I won't mention those. And I just encouraged him and talked with him. To me, that is the expression of my faith. That is how people find God. They find him in the way that you live your life authentically in front of them. Now, because God is ultimately the creator of heaven and earth. And the Bible says concerning him, all good and perfect gifts come down from the Father of lights, in whom there is no variableness, no change, no shadow of turning. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. So if that be true, what I try to do is reflect that in the way I live. In my imperfections, my weaknesses, I just love people. Because ultimately, Jide, I don't care what anybody else says. I'm old enough now to accept and make my own mind up with confidence. Love conquers all. Love is the greatest. The Bible says faith, hope, and love, these three abide. But the greatest of these is love. To watch the Nigerian church, sometimes you'll think the greatest of this is faith.
Wow.
But the Bible says
love is the greatest gift, not faith.
the scripture says it. So I choose to hang my hat on the scripture. Yeah.
Brilliant. Okay, we're about to conclude, but there's some questions that, will require some brief answers. What is the best book you've ever read?
Oh, Jide, that's not a fair question. I tell you why. Because I read about 6 books a month. I've done so for many years now, and so at different seasons of my life, different books have had incredible impacts on me. Some secular, some Christian, but it just depends on the season. So I would do an injustice to pick one specific book.
Okay,
but I'll simply tell you that my favorite writer is Max Lucado.
I know you've cited him a lot in your posts. Yeah, brilliant. What's your favorite quote? If you could just give us any quote, a favorite quote.
Of every 100 men, oh my gosh, I know this quote, but I couldn't tell it to you off the top of my head. It's a fairly lengthy quote. But basically, it's a quote that implies that in a group of 100 men, there's always one who is the ultimate that will bring the others back safely.
Who would you regard as a hero if you believe in heroes? Who's your hero?
My dad.
Brilliant.
My dad was my hero.
Proudest moment?
My proudest moment? I have to say it was maybe holding my first child in my arms at Red Hill Hospital in Surrey, knowing that this was a life that my wife and I had decided together to bring into this world, and we were now responsible for his well-being.
Wow. And
today he's a 25-year-old man making a great for himself.
Fantastic. If you were to put anything on a t-shirt, what would it be? If you were to any inscription on a t-shirt, what would it be?
You know, it seems redundant because Nike has already done it, but I love that. I love the phrase, just do it.
Just do it.
You know, because ultimately it's about life. And whatever it is that you're pursuing, whatever goal you have, just do it.
What would you want your legacy to be?
Yeah, I love that question. Because I've thought about that a lot. I guess when you're in your 50s, you start to think about that a lot. I want my legacy to be that everyone who speaks of or knew me would say he was one of the most authentic, most loving Christ followers I ever met. That's what I would like.
Wow. What's the quality you most admire in a person?
I would say resilience and commitment. I know that's two, but I think they go hand in hand, because it's easy to quit when you're not resilient. But it's hard to be resilient if you're not committed to something, if you don't already have in mind, this is the goal. So that's why, so you'll permit me to say resilience and commitment instead of just one.
Brilliant. And my last question, I always ask my guests this very last question. If you were to pick up, your phone and dial the 20-year-old Joseph Thompson, what would you tell him? What advice would you give that 20-year-old Joseph Thompson?
Oh, that may be my favorite question of all. I love that. I would say to him, to that 20-year-old Joseph Thompson, whatever you start doing, whatever you make a commitment to doing, sink your teeth into it and stick with it for the rest of your life. Wow. It may not look successful now. Wow. It may seem difficult, but if you stick with it, in 20 years, you'd have grown an empire that you'll be able to use to bless millions of people.
Awesome. I knew I would be blessed. I knew I would love having a chat with you. That is it. I've asked, what I'm able to ask within 30 minutes or 32 minutes. I'm sure I'm looking forward to having you in UK when I could actually sit with you and spend more time asking some other questions. But thank you so much for honoring me coming on as a guest on Nigerian Real. Thank you so much. And I wish you all the best in all your endeavors. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jide. Love to your family.
Thank you.